Warmly welcome to this webinar on productivity and productivity commissions. My name is Daniel Lind and I work as a research director at the trade union-related think tank called Arenagruppen. And within Arenagruppen, I'm responsible for the so-called Productivity Commission, which is a 3-year project financed by the 5 unions within Swedish manufacturing. Our main guest today is Dirk Pilat. He's a world-leading productivity analyst and a former deputy director at the STI directorate at OECD. Today, he is a research fellow at the British Productivity Institute and also affiliated to a Spanish Economic Institute. Dirk, we are very honored having you with us today. With us today is also Tobias Brennemo. Tobias is the newly appointed chief economist at Unionen, which is the largest union in Sweden. And the starting point for this webinar is that the Swedish government has announced that a productivity commission will be initiated during this term. And secondly, Dirk is about to finish a report on experiences and lessons from productivity commissions in other countries. So based on Dirk's report, the aim of this webinar is to start the discussion about the upcoming Swedish commission. And the setup for this webinar is very simple. Dirk starts with a presentation for 35-40 minutes, and we open up for a discussion among the 3 of us. And Tobias has the honor to start this discussion with a somewhat lengthier first comment. Of course, we will also take questions from the audience, so please state your questions short and sharply on Facebook, and we will address them later on. Having said all this, Dirk, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Daniel, and it's a real pleasure to be with all of you. Let me start sharing my screen so I can, there we are. I think hopefully you can all see that. What I'll do is really talk a little bit about the role of productivity commissions. And as you said, Daniel, I've been working on productivity for some time, first before I joined the OECD and then out of the OECD. And currently, I'm also a member of the UK Productivity Commission, which is a relatively new body as well. It was only established in 2021. And one of the ideas that came up is to try and see a little bit, well, what are these productivity commissions doing? And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. And what can we learn from that? And of course, hopefully that can be helpful for Sweden as well. Let's see, okay, let's figure it out. Okay, so my outline is talk a little bit about the role of these productivity institutions, what they're doing, and then I'll talk about 2 areas of the work they're focusing on, what I've called direct drivers of productivity. I'll explain that later, and indirect drivers of productivity, and then I'll end up with some conclusions. So first, I think it's important to say, well, why do we care about productivity? Isn't this sort of something that's old hat? We've talked about it in the past, but we shouldn't really care about this anymore. Well, I think it is really important because it's really the only sustainable driver of wages and living standards we have. And if you look back in history, it's really been about productivity growth that has been able to lift a lot of people out of poverty. It has led to a dramatic increase in living standards for much of the world's population and is still doing so in many developing countries. And it has quite a few benefits, direct benefits, tangible benefits on the goods and services we have access to, but also because it helps us to really deal with issues like scarcity. In a sense, we can create new opportunities for governments, for business, but also for workers and for individuals. I also think it's important to say that productivity, to me, is for much more than just labor and capital. It's not only about productivity of labor, it's also we need to look at things like improving productivity in how we use resources and how we use the environment. So those are a few things to talk about. And of course, we can come back to why this is important. Now, the problem we have is that productivity has really declined quite a bit over the past few decades. This is a slide from an OECD publication where basically you can see that before sort of the crisis of 2008, productivity in Sweden in terms of GDP per hour worked was about 2% a year on average. If you look after the crisis from 2010 onwards, it's about 1% or even less in certain periods. And that means we have far less room for maneuver. We have less room for maneuver in real wage growth. We have less room for maneuver as governments and in terms of the growth of our economy. So it is a real constraint that we see in many countries. Now, what productivity institutions are doing across the world is really put productivity back on the policy agenda. It was off the agenda in many countries at some point in time. I think it's now coming back because I think we understand why it's important. And then what they're doing as well is explore the drives of productivity growth and provide advice on productivity policies. Some of these existed already after the Second World War, more on technical advice to business on productivity. But we've seen this emergence of more policy-focused productivity institutions in OECD countries, basically for about two and a half decades. The first one was the Australian Productivity Commission, still very well known, officially established in 1998. It was already there before. Then we had quite a few being set up about 10 years ago. New Zealand, Chile, Denmark, Mexico, Norway had its productivity commissions at some point in time. Some of those have disappeared, like in Norway. And then in 2016, we had the European Council basically saying, well, we recommend the establishment of productivity commissions in Eurozone countries. And we also suggest that countries who are not in the Eurozone set up productivity boards to help sort of put this issue back on the agenda. So now what we have at the moment is about 20 plus productivity commissions in the OECD area. And I'm still talking a little bit about the OECD because that was where I came from, with some more still being established. So Austria was only last year that it was established, and Sweden is probably perhaps this year or at least in the next in the forthcoming future. And there is collaboration between these bodies as well at European level and also at the OECD level. I'm not going to talk too much about this, but there are differences in what these productivity commissions are doing, how they're set up in terms of the institutional setup, the analytical independence, the resources they have available, their responsibilities, but also how they engage with stakeholders. So some are multi-stakeholder institutions, like in Ireland, like in Denmark. In others, they're more academic or more government-focused in terms of their role. And there are differences in the role they play in policymaking as well. I will talk about 11 productivity boards and what they're doing. And this is a very dense slide, but I think it just shows the 11 countries I'll talk about: Australia, Belgium, Denmark, Finland, France, Germany, Ireland, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Portugal, and UK. It shows the date they were established. It shows their mission, and their missions are pretty much the same across all these countries. But it also shows a little bit there are some differences, and those are things I've marked in red. So in terms of the membership, are they mainly academic institutions? Are they multi-stakeholder? Are they mainly government-focused? There are some differences there, and that may have an influence in terms of the type of work they do and how they engage with policy as well. For instance, the UK one I'm a member of, it is not established by government, the only one that has not been established by government, and it's more academically focused than most of the other ones. And there are also some differences into who they report to. The Australian and New Zealand one actually partly report to Parliament. The Belgian one actually sort of reports to the stakeholders, but most of them report to government institutions and more generally. I mentioned the context already. I think we've had this big slowdown in productivity. I just showed it for Sweden, but you see it pretty much across all the board. And I circled here the countries that I'm covering, but you basically see for all the countries, there's a big gap between the little orange sort of diamond you see on the top of the screen, which is labor productivity growth before the crisis, and the black dot, which is labor productivity from 2010 onwards, which is a lot lower for all the countries that we're looking at. Denmark is actually one of the few exceptions if we look at it here. We don't quite know where this comes from. We know there are lots of factors that are contributing to the slowdown in productivity. We've seen a slowdown in investment. We just basically firms are no longer investing as much as they did in the 80s and the 90s as they do at the moment. And that, of course, means we have less capital formation, and that has an impact on productivity. We think that technological progress may have slowed down. We probably have We seem to have more difficulty finding new ideas and new technologies. Even though we do see a lot of technology, it doesn't seem to have the same impact. We've seen some structural changes. Manufacturing, which has always been an important sector for the productivity, has basically declined. We've seen a growth of services. We've probably seen less diffusion from leaders to followers, which I'll come back to later on. Demographic factors may have played a role. So lots of things that probably have led to, more generally at a structural level, at a global level, have led to some slowdown in productivity. And there are things that also may play a role at the national level, and that's often what a lot of these productivity boards are looking at: the lack of skills, the growing skills mismatch. Basically, we don't seem to have the right skills anymore in many cases. Quality of management is an issue, the gap in innovation or the uptake of new technologies, and also things like how labor and product markets are functioning in certain countries. That seems to be coming up as well in some countries. So what are these productivity boards doing in practice about all of that? They're promoting thinking and understanding of productivity. They are analyzing productivity to try to understand what are some of the factors that may contribute to productivity growth. And sometimes they even try to say, well, what are the ones that we can actually have an influence on? What are the global factors? We can't do much at the national level about globalization. We can't do much on the rate of technological progress, but there are things we can do something about, which is skills, the innovation system, our business environment, and things like that. And then they explore these issues, provide recommendations to government, contribute to relevant policy discussions, and also engage often at the international level. So that's a little bit, briefly, I'll leave you a little bit of a flavor on the Productivity Commission. So let me stop here for a second, Daniel, and see if you have any questions right now. Otherwise, I'll continue on the second part.
No, you can continue. No questions arrived yet.
Okay, good. So on the direct drivers of productivity, and I'm not going to go into too technical here, but direct drivers of productivity, what economists tend to do, they think about production factors that basically play a role in a company. And we typically there talk about capital, investment, intangible capital, machinery, equipment, buildings, and intangible capital, things like software, research and development, skills, and things like that. So capital is the first driver I'll look at. Second one is labor. And there, of course, we basically look very much at skills and human capital. And then the third one is really around technology, innovation, digital technologies, but also, I think, very important, the role of entrepreneurship and the fact that we have a lot of new firms that are being created, some firms that grow very rapidly, and also some firms that leave the market. And that has an enormous amount of influence as well on productivity. So those are what I call the direct drivers of productivity. And that's the first part I'll talk a little bit about in this now. And I have four relatively large tables, but they're basically trying to give you a little bit of a flavor of some of the things that these productivity commissions are talking about when they talk about these issues. So on investment, they typically distinguish between the drivers understanding the overall level of investment. Why has it declined? And what can we do about it? And secondly, they look at specific areas of investment. So they look at public investment, they look at infrastructure, they look at investment for the green transition, they look at housing, for instance, in Ireland, and they look then at a number of policy issues there as well. So if you're looking at investment, there's a lot of discussion here about the role that, for instance, structural changes have made, and the fact that we've had this shift from manufacturing and services that's had played a role in how the decline of investment. The role of interest rates and high interest rates in cases and high cost of capital, uncertainty, an issue in quite a few countries, Portugal and the UK. I say we've had a lot of uncertainty. We've had problems here also with the overall business environment in the UK context. And that then leads to a number of policy recommendations that are coming from these boards on sound fiscal policy. We need to have room for public investment, so we need to be careful with our government finances, efficient public spending, the tax system, it needs to be competitive, a reliable, stable business and regulatory environment, and also attractiveness to foreign and direct investment. These are the areas where a lot of these commissions are providing recommendations. On the specific areas of investment, there tends to be a lot of discussion, particularly around public investment. A lot of countries basically saying, we have not really kept up with public investment. We're not investing enough in infrastructure. We're not investing enough in some of these issues like the green transition. So those are issues that a lot of countries are talking about Interesting as well, Ireland basically really talks about housing as a constraint that basically is affecting its productivity and competitiveness. And that then again leads to recommendations linked to planning, for instance, but also to tax policies that can help in this area. The larger one, and probably I think overall the topic that productivity boards seem to be talking about the most in the work I've seen so far is human capital. Skills is probably the biggest topic I think that countries are really looking at and worried about, basically saying we don't have the right skills anymore. And also, for instance, what you're seeing here, I have 4 categories here: general education skills, specific skills, attractiveness to talent, and also what is called skills mismatch. Lots of interesting things that are coming out of the work. I won't touch on all of them, but for instance, the French Productivity Board is basically saying, well, our education system has not really been able to lower inequalities in the country. A lot of the slowdown we have in productivity comes from human capital. We just basically, the workers don't have the same enough skills anymore, and we're not increasing them rapidly enough to really help. A lot of discussion on specific skills, on digital skills, on quality of management, on what is sometimes called softer skills, vocational skills, and a lot of recommendations that countries are giving here around the new skills that are needed and the policies that need to be put in place for that. Attractiveness to foreign talent, I'll come back to that later on as well on the labor markets, really a big issue for many countries where they're looking at, well, how can we do more? For instance, in the case of Denmark with refugees, employment policies for refugees, how we can look at our sort of immigration policies, reform them, make them fast track, and maybe more focused on sort of the skills that are coming in. And also there are discussions here about the negative impacts it may have on wages of domestic workers in Denmark, for instance. And then finally, the issue of skills mismatch, which is basically saying that we have a lot of people who have very good high skills that are sometimes in jobs that are probably not quite suited for them. And we have a lot of people who are really lacking the skills for the job they're in. So how do we deal with that? And that is also seen as an issue that may have increased with the COVID crisis over the years. So here, a lot of the discussions about how can we make our skill system better, more agile, more responsive to these changing skills needs over time. Third issue, innovation and digitalization. Very big topic as well. Lots of discussion on this, on, for instance, R&D, research and development, on the innovation system, on teleworking, of course, particularly linked to the COVID crisis, on the use of technology, and also on data. Again, I think interesting insights on, for instance, the role of direct support for R&D, how governments are supporting private R&D to tax credits, to direct support, what Finland is talking about, on the role of public procurement. A lot of discussion on sort of innovation policies, where Australia basically was saying, well, we've far too much focused on the more innovative firms, not enough on the diffusion of technology to more less innovative firms, and also countries more thinking about more focused innovation policies. For instance, the case of New Zealand basically saying, well, we need to target much more. We need to be much more focused in what we're trying to do. A lot of discussion, of course, about remote work. A lot of these, particularly the past few years, of course, and with the COVID crisis, a lot of countries are talking about that and what needs to be done linked to that. Infrastructure funding, but also sometimes changes in legislation linked to teleworking at home, and in the case of Ireland. A lot of discussion on advanced technology use. And finally, on data as sort of seen as a new driver of productivity, a new asset, a new type of capital that we need to invest in. And then finally, the whole issue of entrepreneurship and business dynamics. And this may be one that is a little bit less familiar, I think, to people, but there's a lot of discussion here basically about the fact that we've seen a decline in the entry of new firms. We have far fewer firms being created in most countries than we had before, and that means that we have less renewal of business. We have far, you need sometimes these startups to come into the market to do new things, to shake up things a little bit, and to also create new opportunities for businesses. But we've seen this problem in quite a few countries. So this is something that quite a number of countries are talking about, the decline in startups and what needs to be done around that. A lot of the countries are also talking about the fact that they don't have what we call frontier firms. They're really sort of productive, sort of globally leading firms, what sometimes many countries are talking about, and well, how can we get those? What we need to do around that? It's an issue that Finland, for instance, was talking about, but also countries like New Zealand and are talking about. A problem of resource allocation, that sometimes the most productive firms that we have are just too small. They just basically don't grow enough. They don't become important enough. The role of COVID, basically when we had the COVID crisis, we had a lot of less new firms being created, but we also basically were supporting a lot of firms, I think rightly, to get through the crisis, but that sometimes also meant that we were protecting a lot of firms that might have gone bankrupt in otherwise. So these are issues that a lot of countries are talking about at the moment in their reports, where, of course, a lot of issues come to the agenda as well. So let me conclude briefly on that and stop then for a second, because I know this is a lot of dense information. I'm just trying to give you a bit of a flavor of what these productivity commissions are doing. I'm not trying to, I can't go into detail on everything, but I think there are a couple of conclusions I draw from this. First is that even though we noticed that there's been this big slowdown in aggregate investment, I don't think a lot of productivity commissions are providing a lot of advice. Is there anything we can actually do about this? Is this basically just a fact of life? It's structural, it's just global. We can't really do much about it. Or is it something that we can help do it? And interestingly, there are very few productivity commissions that even talk about macroeconomic policy. There are very few that talk about financial markets. And there are very few that talk about what we call intangible investments. So these more softer types of investment in software, in R&D, in organizational change. Very few talk about, well, what we can do around that in policy terms. Human capital skills, I think this is probably the biggest topic that productivity commissions talk about across the world at the moment. I think considering that typically economists, when they do what we call growth accounting, we try to understand what are the main drivers of growth. Human capital actually doesn't come out as necessarily the most important one. But I think if you look at the work here, everybody considers this as an issue because basically they consider skill shortages and skills linked to that as a very important barrier to productivity growth. Innovation and technology, also explored by a lot of countries, a relatively standard policy advice here, but there are some new issues as well, data, artificial intelligence, more focused innovation policies, but very little work on technology diffusion, even though I think we recognize this is probably a very important problem for productivity at the moment. And then finally, although it's a relatively new issue for many, for the analysis of productivity, a lot of interest in entrepreneurship and business dynamics. And I think in understanding this is important for productivity, but perhaps too little focus on these frontier firms compared to what we typically are saying about the lagging firms, which I think people are more focused on so far. So that's a little bit what I've learned from what I think we are seeing in this area at the moment. And let me stop here for a second, Daniel, if you have any questions.
Oh, please continue. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
So let me go into the indirect drivers of productivity, and I call these indirect because they're a little bit more external to the firm. They influence what firms do. They influence how productivity is growing, but they're a bit more sort of outside the direct control of the firm. So trade, foreign direct investment, global value chains, the business environment, competition, regulation, structural policies, industrial policies, regional policies, energy and environmental policy becoming more important, and also labor market policies and social policies. And I'll be a lot more quick about that, but because I just want to give you a little bit of a flavor here about what is happening in this area. So the first area is trade and foreign direct investment. And what's interesting here is I think that European countries typically don't talk about this very much, at least the productivity commissions, European countries. And partly this may be because trade in particular is a European responsibility. So there is less that actually a national productivity board can talk about this in terms of policy advice. We see more discussion in countries like Australia and New Zealand on trade policies. For instance, Australia talking about tariffs, on trade and services as areas they can do something around. But there is more discussion, I think, in many countries on, also in Europe, on foreign direct investment. How can we become more attractive to foreign direct investment, and what can we do around that? Interestingly, particularly the last report from Germany, there is more focus on integration in the world economy and also some of the policies around that. So it is becoming, I think, a bit more of a focus at the moment in the context also of being more autonomous, being more resilient, being less dependent on critical minerals and energy and so on in different countries. On the business environment, the big issue here is competition policy and competition more generally. I think it's an issue that a lot of countries are worried about, basically saying we are no longer able, we're not sure what we have, the competition policy is working for us. New Zealand also talking about more innovation-friendly regulation. So it is an area that is on the agenda here a little bit, that countries are looking at sometimes specific sectors as well. For instance, in Ireland, a lot of discussion on things like banking and insurance and legal services as areas where there is just not enough competition in Ireland, and that then has an impact on costs for businesses and also on productivity. Third area, structural policies and also industrial policies, where a lot of discussion at the moment in Europe happening linked to industrial policies. Can Europe perhaps play more of a role here? So you do see some of this discussion happening, particularly from a country like France, where basically saying, well, perhaps we need to do more to develop new industrial activities that can help us or get more sort of support for productivity. However, Germany until recently was more talking about, well, be very careful in this area. And of course, this is a shifting debate at the moment, I think, in many countries. So a relatively limited focus, I think, in this area at the moment over the past few years on industrial policy, if we look across the work of the productivity commissions. Regional policy, even less of an issue. Australia and Denmark are countries that have looked at cities, the role of cities for productivity. So trying to understand what do we need to do to make cities also drivers of productivity in terms of infrastructure, the governance of tax policies linked to it. So those are topics that come on the agenda there. The main exception here is the United Kingdom, where there's been a lot of discussion on what is called leveling up. It's basically saying, well, we need to move beyond London as the center of economic activity and productivity in the UK to also give more weight to other regions of the country to empower local leadership. So there you see a little bit more broader agenda also linked to regions happening as well. Then I think a really important one is energy, environment, and resource policies. And this is coming a little bit more on the agenda. I think what a lot of these productivity commissions were doing until recently, they were basically saying, well, we need to have climate policies that are as efficient as possible. We need to make sure we don't distort the market. We need to use tax credits or carbon taxation as much as possible. There is now a little bit more thinking happening as well on the link to labor productivity and more general. So Belgium's last report spoke about this. Germany was talking a lot about dependency of energy and critical raw materials, the need for diversification and resilience. And also Ireland was thinking more about how can we look at the link between competitiveness and climate change policy. So it is a little bit on the agenda. However, there is not a lot of thinking yet on things like energy productivity and resource productivity and things like that. So it is happening a little bit in this area, but it's still an emerging topic, I think, for most of these productivity commissions. Finally, social and labor market policies. Labor market policies are an issue, I think, for a number of countries, more from the perspective of labor market participation that a number of countries are thinking about, like Germany and Ireland, saying, well, we are really dealing with the fact that we have skill shortages, so we need to make sure we really tap into all the available talent. So we need to look at underrepresentation in the labor market and see what we can do around that. And then there are a few countries like Australia and Portugal that are more talking about more traditional issues like flexibility in the labor market and labor market segmentation. The big topic here, I think, under this heading is really immigration policy. This is where a lot of countries are looking at trying to see, well, how can we link immigration policies more to the productivity agenda, bring in the right skills, better options for migrants in a country, reforming our skilled migration system. That's something both Australia and New Zealand are talking about. In Ireland, a lot of people coming back from abroad to bring them back into the labor market. So this is a topic that I think is very much on the agenda in quite a few countries at the moment. And then finally, there are a few other issues that countries are talking about, not a lot, a little bit about the productivity of government services, the health system that comes up in a few countries, basically the health of employees and of workers as an issue for productivity. Ireland has looked at housing markets, and also the measurement of productivity is a big theme. So that's a little bit of an overview of what I think is happening around these indirect drivers of productivity. And let me stop here for a second before I try to wrap it all up.
You can continue, please.
Okay. So let me try to say a little bit what I think I've learned from looking at the work of these productivity commissions. I think overall there is a common agenda. There is an agenda that a lot of these productivity commissions are looking at. There are some variations, but there is an understanding that there are certain things that are driving productivity. And if you want to promote productivity in your country, you need to try and also think about them, provide policy advice. Most of the work is focused on what I've called these direct drivers of productivity. So it's on investment, it's on human capital and skills, it's on innovation, it's on digitalization, it's on entrepreneurship. That's where a lot of the agenda of these productivity commissions are currently focused on. There's less work on these indirect drivers, and some issues really haven't been addressed by many commissions yet. So not a lot of work on regions, not a lot of work on industrial policies, not a lot of work on environment, even though it's starting to pick up a little bit in the latest reports. It's not always clear where the agenda for these productivity commissions comes from. You know, why are some topics picked up? Why are other topics not picked up? I think what's interesting to see with a country like France, when they started their work in 2018, 2019, they did a big report to really map productivity in France and try to understand what are the most important factors. And then they followed up on some of these things in later reports. So they've started to continue to look at these things, but only a few productivity commissions have done that. So in terms of really quantifying what they think is really important for productivity in a country, and then focusing specifically on those issues. Another option is that this is more about policy and political considerations. Where is change possible? What can we recommend? Where can we make a difference at a productivity commission? What are the most important things to focus on? The composition of the boards, and that's what I spoke about completely in the beginning, may matter. If you are more academic boards, like you are France and Germany, you may be more focusing, well, what's the academic literature telling me? What is the academic research telling me about productivity? Or are you also listening to business, as is the case, for instance, in Ireland? Why they were talking about business costs? Well, probably because it's a big issue for business. So the fact that we have more academic boards, more government boards, or more multi-stakeholder boards may make a difference as well for the agenda that we're seeing in these boards. And probably the international agenda at the European level, at the OECD level, may also have some influence in terms of choice of topics, because that can play a role in the analysis that we're seeing. Analysis, I think most of the work from the productivity commissions follows relatively standard lines. So there's a lot of work, and I'm not going to go through all the technical terms here, but a lot of the work is relatively standard. What you typically do when you look at productivity, you're trying to look at the trends, you're trying to sort of do some economic modeling, you're trying to understand the role of industries and of firms, you're trying to compare productivity across countries, you're trying to look at specific factors. So you're trying to do that. And there are some new, I think, interesting insights emerging from that work. I think France, for instance, is really saying that for us, human capital is really the most important factor in explaining the slowdown. That is interesting. New Zealand has done a lot of work on these frontier firms. That is interesting. Australia and Germany are looking into data and productivity. So there are some of these new issues that are coming up that are not always tackled yet that much in some of the academic literature. There are some issues that have not received a lot of attention. So there is relatively little policy analysis of this slowdown in investment to try and really understand, well, why is it happening, and is there anything we can do about it? As I mentioned, little attention for financial markets and macroeconomic policy. little on technology diffusion, which is probably something that is important, and relatively little on competition, and particularly in the whole discussion that we're having in many countries on the digital economy, the slowdown in business economics and business dynamics. We might have seen more work on competition, but it's not there in many countries yet. On the policy insights, I think a lot of the policy recommendations that we are seeing at the moment are relatively familiar. I've worked at the OECD for 28 years, and so I've seen the structural reform agenda sort of moving ahead. And I think a lot of the insights in these reports really reflect the insights from long-standing work on productivity and structural reform. There are some areas where I think we're starting to move a little bit beyond that. For instance, New Zealand, I think the whole doing a lot of work on trying to see, well, can we have more focused, targeted, what's sometimes called mission-oriented innovation policies to really focus on problems in our countries. Germany's latest report is talking about things like sovereignty, strategic economy, autonomy, really linked to the shortages of energy and raw materials. The interest in data is something that is, I think, new. A lot of interest in skills and skills policies, and also a lot of interest in immigration. So there are some new issues, I think, are relatively new issues here as on the agenda. And again, and I mentioned this, a lot of this already, some important issues that haven't received a lot of attention in that agenda, like investment, like technology and diffusion, and also like competition. There are some gaps in the work of the productivity commissions. I think, to me, they're the four probably most important one, even though it's starting to change a little bit, is the impact of climate change on productivity. Even we know that this is going to really change our economy and society a lot, but there isn't that much work on it yet. And also, most productivity commissions say, well, we are about labor productivity. We are about what is called multi-factor productivity. We don't talk that much about environmental productivity or resource productivity. This is starting to change a little bit. Belgium and Ireland, in their last reports, both talk about this. Not a lot of work on intermediates. So basically, we can look at productivity, looking at labor and capital, but we can also look at things like energy, materials, and services inputs. And apart from France, not a lot of work on that, even though also the Germany's last report is going in that direction. Not a lot of work on productivity of the public sector as a topic and its impact on aggregate productivity. And finally, to me, one of the most areas probably missing the most is really the link on the whole discussion on wages, inequality, and well-being. Not a lot of work on how the benefits of productivity are spread to workers across the economy through wages, how that affects inequality. And also, there are very few commissions looking beyond GDP at broader measures of well-being. Austria's Productivity Commission, I spoke to, gave a talk at Austria's Productivity Commission last week, and they are actually moving more in that direction as well. And they want to look at that issue as well. One point here is that some of these issues may perhaps not always be included in the official mandates of Productivity Commission. Some cases, there may be other institutions already in a country that are covering certain things. So perhaps macroeconomic policy and financial markets are already addressed by others, and perhaps they don't want Productivity Commissions to really also discuss that issue in detail. Regional policies, not addressed by many, also because sometimes they may not be considered in bounds or really part of what a Productivity Commission should be talking about. Trade policies, I mentioned that already. EU countries really don't talk about that because the European Commission deals with that. And also things like governance and institutions may be considered out of scope that a lot of productivity commissions don't talk about. So there are things that are not covered by productivity commissions. And of course, that is a choice that governments make in terms of when they set up these bodies, in terms of, well, what's the mandate? And also, what are other commissions doing? Do you have a competition commission, for instance, that already is focusing on competition? Do you have a fiscal council? Do you have a central bank that is already doing monetary policy? So you don't necessarily want the productivity commission to talk about that as well. So my final conclusions is basically that I do think these productivity commissions play an important role because they're putting productivity back on the policy agenda. And it really was off the agenda for a while. And this is still one of the most important drivers of change in our countries. And so it is important to have that somewhere being addressed in the agenda as a place to look at it. But it is a relatively new, most of these commissions are relatively new. The agenda is still evolving. And also since, a lot of them were established in 2018, 2019, the COVID crisis came in very quickly. So a lot of countries, commissions have also looked at that for quite a bit, for a while, which may have meant that they were less focusing on the long to medium term agenda. There's a lot of, I think, interesting work emerging. It is not yet clear, I think, how much that will really influence how we think about productivity, what we think about the drivers of productivity, and that will, I think, be an important thing to look at. A lot of the policy advice is, I think, relatively well known, reflecting work on structural reform that we've seen for many years. But there are some new issues, I think, that are starting to be tackled. So I think there are some more complex, more difficult issues, perhaps new issues that are now on the agenda. I think the link between climate change and productivity, the discussion on strategic autonomy, industrial policies, more mission-oriented innovation policies, these are things that are starting to be looked at by some of these commissions, which might be interesting. There is a lot of scope for collaboration, I think, between these commissions. There is a lot of new work happening. Of course, they talk to each other in the European level, at the OECD level, but I think there's a lot of scope also for bilateral, multilateral exchanges between these commissions to learn from each other, not only on how to do things, but also on the analysis and on the policy insights, the policy messages that are coming out. And I think overall, this is an interesting or important experiment with a new set of institutions. So it is important to really draw on that, to use that as a way that we can learn more about productivity and to make sure that we really benefit from the work that these productivity commissions are doing across the European and OECD countries. So let me stop there. I know I covered a lot. I also know I sometimes speak relatively fast, so I'm happy to later on to provide the presentations to everybody. But I just wanted to give you a flavor of what these commissions are doing. And there's a lot of work here to talk about, but it gives you hopefully a little bit of an idea to what is going on here and how it may also be helpful for debate in Finland. Comments welcome, and otherwise there are 2 contact numbers here as well. Just drop me a line if you have any questions. So let me stop there and stop sharing my screen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dirk, for a very informative presentation for us. I think this is a very good starting point for a discussion in Sweden on productivity and productivity commissions. But before I hand the word to Tobias, I just want to ask you one question. And it's related to the difference between productivity and competitiveness. Some commissions work with both, some work with only productivity. Can you give us a word on the difference and similarities here?
That is a great question. I think there are a few commissions that have been established based on existing competitiveness council. I was a member of the Irish Competitiveness and Productivity Council, and that started, and that was been around for I think 25 years or so. But it started out as a competitiveness council, what it was really looking at Ireland in terms of its broader settings in trade and making sure the Irish economy remained competitive. But then the productivity mandate came from the European level and basically say, well, it would be good if you would also be looking at productivity. So you have some of these councils that were then turned into to productivity and competitiveness council. And that's the case in Ireland, a little bit like also that if you look at the Danish Economic Council or the German Economic Council, they had much broader mandates, and they do productivity now, but they do a lot of other things too. So they are broader councils. The difference is, to some extent, competitiveness is probably more focused on the trade side, is more focused on making sure your firms remain competitive in the global economy. So it has more of an annotation with that in terms of international competition. Whereas I think productivity is also much more about living standards. I mean, there are relationships between them. And so I think we can, of course, there's some important relationship, but I do think productivity, to me, is a broader concept. And I think it is something that you can probably link to to more things, and I think my presentation gave you perhaps a bit of a flavor of that. There is, it is something that's pretty central for many things we see happening in our economy. So in a sense, it is a very core driver of many things that are happening. So in that sense, I think productivity to me is more important than competitiveness, even though it's fine and helpful to look at competitiveness too.
And thanks. Okay, Tobias, the floor is yours for a starting lengthy comment, rather lengthy comment. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. And of course, thank you, Dirk, for this very interesting, the whole paper and this presentation that gave us very nice flavors of your work. And the paper gives us both an easy to read overview and also a very thorough review of the work from these 11 commissions. So thank you for that. And it will be a great help for us when we discuss the coming Swedish commission. I think you summarized it very well in one of your last slides, a couple of important topics that should not be forgotten in the coming Swedish work, with the climate change and analysis of the productivity in the public sector. Another sector that I don't know if it's an international phenomenon or Swedish, but we have seen for a long period of time that the construction sector is lagging in productivity level. Maybe that's something to look closer to as well. And of course, for us, the very important question about wages and distribution and inequality and the well-being of workers that I will get back to. So I'm just going to start with some comments and maybe some questions for you, and we'll then gladly join you and Daniel for discussion in of the coming Swedish Commission. And just a brief presentation. As Daniel said, I'm the chief economist of Unionen, which is Swedish largest trade union with almost we have almost 700,000 members, and we organize white-collar workers in all industries in the business sector in Sweden. And we also have a central role in Swedish in the wage formation system, and where in each big collective bargaining rounds for new central collective agreements, we and the other unions that have members in the manufacturing industry sector negotiates agreements first, and then the results from them become normative for other for the rest of the labor market. And we are right now in one of these big rounds with agreements that should be in place at the end of March. And having this position makes us very aware of the importance of productivity growth as a key factor for growth of the economy, for Swedish international competitiveness, and maybe most of all, for us to be able to deliver real wage growth for our members over time. And we in Sweden we have had, as we've seen in your one of your earlier slides, have had a higher productivity growth than many other comparable countries, especially during the period before the great financial crisis. And we have also in comparison to other countries, a higher real wage growth during the last 25 years or so. And this we have been able to do so without risking Swedish international competitiveness because of our higher productivity growth. But as we saw in your pictures as well, there has been this difference in the productivity growth in Sweden compared to other countries were absolutely more distinguished in the period before the financial crisis than it has been in the last 10 or 15 years. And of course, we, as all other, are concerned about this downshift. It's not that bad in Sweden compared to compared to the UK, for example. We're not lagging behind other countries, but we're not leading in the way that we did before. I think your graph had numbers up to 2019, and actually, we have been quite surprised during the last 3 years, from then up to 2021 at least, with quite high productivity numbers. They have been in average over 2% again in the business sector as a whole. So that's a bit more than the last 10 years or so, but still a big downshift from the situation before the financial crisis. And it's still a big concern. And this is also the reason why we appointed our own productivity commission led by Daniel, and also why we, of course, have a great interest in the new national commission. Would just like to address a couple of issues from your review, from your report and presentation, and mainly focus on, all of these commissions come to some common conclusions, and which goes in line with common knowledge or research that, of course, we have to find ways to promote investments in both means of production and in human capital, and they must be in such a nature that they constantly result in renewal and development. But I will focus more on the human capital side of this, of course, from a union perspective. Of course, the question of education is a key component for every country's long-term productivity growth, and maybe not just education as we normally see it, but from very, very young ages, even during our whole working life. I think it's absolutely a big question, an important question with how we start already at very young ages with setting the grounds for future developments. And it was interesting to see that in many of the commissions that you review, as they have been doing their work during the pandemic, they have been worried about school closings during the pandemic, and that, of course, was a big debate during the pandemic and the responses to the pandemic. And maybe we can be glad that we in Sweden had an approach to not close schools, so we don't have that worry as many other countries will have now. How will the effect of school closings be in the long run? But we have other problems in Sweden with our schooling and education system. We have had a period of decreasing results in the PISA tests, a high number of students leaving school without sufficient grades, and also, probably quite important, quite a long-term decline in the status of the teacher profession, and which maybe over time affects the quality of teaching and the schooling system. So I think it's absolutely crucial to start at early ages, establish some willingness and curiosity in young children for learning and understanding that things can be developed and invented and changed, and that they can see a future in where they can participate in this. Of course, another very important aspect is for the development of the human capital is how we upgrade our skills and knowledge during the whole of the working life, and it's becoming more and more important questions with the faster technology changes. So we know that when the economy and the technology changes, we need to accept that, and we need to adapt to that, and accept that we need to be able to change jobs during the whole working life in another way than we have in the past. And many, or at least a couple of your policies suggestions from the other commissions, just to with regard to that, to promote successful and fair transitions from declining to expanding jobs. And just that has been a main task for union in Sweden in the past almost 2 decades, just to find how can we improve this. And now, finally, we have a system in place to increase workers' possibilities to educate themselves during their working life, and also to have the economic possibilities to do so with a new agreement that is in place since last fall. And with this, you can study during your working life and get up to 80% of your normal salary. You can do this corresponding to 1 year full-time studies, but as most people will, they will do it part-time, so they can do it over several years. And besides that, you still work part-time at your ordinary job. So we have this agreement in place. We have the fundings in place, but now we need the education system to adapt to these increasing needs of education that is suitable for the working population, and not just the education you do before you start your careers. So we need courses that are shorter, more part-time courses, and courses that are possible to study at distance, that you can do this besides of your ordinary work. So maybe this could be it's an important topic for politicians, but maybe also for a productivity commission, from a productivity point of view, to see that these changes really happen, so that we don't waste this great potential from this new system that it has. And also have to add, even with the system in place, it's still crucial for employers to take responsibility to train and to educate their staff, so they keep both employees and the company competitive in the long run. One topic that caught my interest was that you mentioned briefly in the presentation as well, is how do we construct support systems for companies in the event of economic crises? And how do we do that without harming some necessary structural changes that need to be done? The whole discussion of zombie firms after COVID-19 responses. It can still be important for governments to be able to save jobs in the event of big crises, and just to prevent unnecessary capital destruction, and to lose jobs that not should be lost. Your paper mentions some example from I think it was the Danish commission, that had recommendations how you should design such support packages. It would be interesting to hear if you have any more knowledge of that. Because from a Swedish union perspective, we have never been, and that maybe separates us from many of our colleagues in the rest of Europe, especially in the south of Europe, maybe, that we have never been afraid of structural changes or technical inventions, even if it means that old jobs disappears. We see it as a chance to create new and better and more productive jobs. But really important to achieve, for us to have to see it in that way, and to achieve a high grade of some acceptance for this to happen, it's of course it's really important to that people can know that the gains from such changes and improvements, that they are, as you mentioned, equally distributed and fairly distributed among workers and among the population. And also that these changes can be achieved without decreasing, or with maintaining, or even better, to improve the level of well-being in the workforce. And this is probably very often forgotten when on the company level, when companies try to just improve their efficiency by reducing the workforce and let fewer people do the same job as more people did before. Of course, we're very short-sighted, and just leads to higher sick leaves and reduced well-being. If we want people to be creative and come up with new inventions and ideas, it's also absolutely direct counterproductive. So, and this is also, I think, related with another interesting perspective in your review and from many of the other commissions, that the question about well-functioning leadership or managing, don't think that's have been a big question in the Swedish productivity debates, but it's very interesting and of course important to have an including and encouraging leadership that promotes so it can promote creativity. And I absolutely think that strong unions can be a help in this aspect to get good leaders that motivates their staff and creates a productive and innovative climate at the workplace. It must be a much better way to organize the business than any kind of micromanaging system. So I think it's really important not to forget that aspect and to have the whole workers' view on this, and also important when it comes to the composition of a new commission in Sweden. We should, and now maybe I address Daniel, do what we can to have representations from unions to secure this workers or union perspective, even in the new Swedish national commissions. And I think we are absolutely many of us that are ready to take that role. So I think I stop there and maybe.
Thanks, Tobias. Dirk, do you have any reflections on the main points of Tobias?
Yeah, no. First, thank you. I mean, I think there were some interesting points there, and just a couple of points, perhaps. I mean, and perhaps I'll take them in reverse order as you mentioned them, Tobias. I thought the first point, perhaps a little bit on. You spoke a little bit about in the end about the composition of commissions, and I do think that's interesting. You know, I think to some extent the productivity agenda, and I've worked on productivity for many years, it's a very broad agenda. It covers many different issues, and that's a problem for academics. It's a problem for government officials. It's a problem for whoever is working in this field. If you want to bring that into a conversation in one commission, there are very few academics who have that reach. There are very few. So I think it's actually not a bad idea. What I enjoyed being on a productivity commission in Ireland, which is multi-stakeholder. So you had government, you had business, you had trade unions, and you had academics to some extent. And it was actually quite interesting because you have very different perspectives on different things. There are also some topics that, and you mentioned, for instance, the inside organization of firms. These are things that economists, if you're an academic working on productivity, a lot of people won't touch on that very quickly because we know something about it, but government officials will say, well, how can I influence that? Whereas people who work in business or work with trade unions may say, well, but we think it's important. Let's put it on the agenda. Let's talk about it. Let's see if there's anything we can do about that. So I think to have these diverse perspectives inside or outside a commission, I think is interesting. And how you do that precisely, there's a whole discussion about the European level on this as well. I mean, what's the best way of organizing this? Whether you want to have that come from the outside of the Productivity Commission, the Australian Productivity Commission, for instance, when they do a review, they have a whole consultation process going on the report. There are other commissions who have the stakeholders within the commission. So there are different ways of doing that, but I do think it is an important point. And I think the interesting thing is the issue of management. Management was always something that was considered to be a little bit out of bounds. We didn't know really, we knew it was important, but how can you influence management? And I think now we have more economic research on the topic, and people say, well, there are things you can do about management. There are things you can do about how, sort of succession processes in companies where sometimes some countries, for instance, there was a favoring of family ownership to some extent, which is not always a good thing. So there are things like that you can talk about in terms of making that link to productivity. Two final points. I think one, I think an issue here as well is the research and productivity goes into many different areas, but there are also some issues when you talk about a policy problem like education. You very quickly need to bring other expertise into the picture. So the people who work on productivity have not looked, for instance, the fact that you probably want to start education at a very young age, which is something, all the OECD work I know about from, early childhood education is really important for education and for skills development over time. But it is not something that would probably be linked to the productivity agenda. You need to sort of start then. But if you want to talk about skills and education as a driver of productivity, you also need to talk to people who are thinking about those things and bring that into the conversation and bring that into the agenda. So that's the problem a little bit, I think, productivity commissions are having. It's a very broad ranging agenda, and there are many things you can talk about. And if you want to bring the right expertise in, it's not particularly easy to do all of that. It's not an easy topic to work on. My final point is a little bit perhaps on Sweden not being afraid of technical change, and I mentioned earlier on to Daniel when we were starting this conversation, I attended meetings of trade unions at the OECD with OECD staff, and it was always interesting to see the variation between countries and what trade unions thought about productivity. Sweden, I think, is always one of those countries that actually has said, productivity is not a bad thing. It's something that's good for wages, it's good for incomes, it has all sorts of things that are important. Whereas if you have other countries in the OECD area, their trade unions were a bit more reluctant to say this is important. So I think, to me, productivity is a central thing to be looking at and to understand and to look at in terms of what it can do, because it gives you more options. If you have higher productivity growth, as you mentioned, Tobias, in Sweden, it gives more room for real wage growth. It gives more room for government budget. It gives more room for all sorts of things. If you have very low productivity growth, as the UK has at the moment, it's zero or it's probably even negative. It's very hard to do that. So I think that's one of the important points about productivity growth. It gives you those options. It gives you room for maneuver as a government, as a business, but also as workers and as society. So let me stop there, and hopefully there are some other questions. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Actually, I will start with a question about the education issue, Dirk. Because there was an opinion text in the biggest business daily a week ago about the coming commission in Sweden. And they argue that the problems with productivity is so complex today that you need more of a multidisciplinary approach to understand productivity and also how to get it to be a welfare increasing topic for all people. So I can see the same argument that the problems are so complex that we need many different scholars to understand this.
Well, I actually agree with that. When I joined the Productivity Institute in the UK in October last year, and I wrote a small blog for them where I said one of the important things is really multidisciplinary focus in looking at these issues. And that's one of the things that we used to do quite a lot at the OECD. I used to work a lot on what the OECD called horizontal projects, where you work across the whole organization on a topic. And I think that's important. I'm an economist by training, but I think it's very important to work with people from other disciplines on certain topics, because I'm not an education expert. So it's very good to bring in people who work on education policy, who work on social policies, who work on all these other issues, and try to see whether you can get a common perspective and work on it together. But yeah, that is what I said earlier on. That's one of the challenges of a productivity agenda. It touches on so many different issues. But it's not a bad thing that there is a place where some of these things are coming together, because you can start to think about trade-offs. You can start to think about different angles. But it puts a lot of burden on the people who are in that commission and how you set that up.
Maybe more complex, but on the other hand, more relevant.
Hopefully, yeah.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
Well, what are your view, Tobias, on the multidisciplinary approach? How do you think about the productivity in this term?
No, I absolutely think it needs to be organized in that way. It's it's a too complex area not to have different opinions from different fields. I absolutely think so.
Okay.
A question for Dirk?
Yeah, sure.
Sure.
You mentioned the example from France with the conclusion that the human capital is explaining the slowdown in productivity growth there, as I understand it. Could you say something more about those findings?
Yeah, no, I think we've probably all seen that to some extent. I mean, the way it works in a lot of analysis of productivity, we basically look at the levels of education and skills that people reach, and then the role they play in the workforce. And of course, if you look at my parents, or the previous generation, or the previous generation before that, had far less education than we do, and newer generations typically have, again, a little bit more than we do, or at least and the increase in terms of education levels and skills to some extent has become smaller and smaller. If you go from people only having primary education to primary education and a few years of secondary education to a lot of people having university education, that's where we are at the moment. And there's probably not a lot of extra education that you can still give people in terms of years of schooling. I think you can give different schooling, and you spoke about that in your comments. I mean, and you can, and I think you need to keep on training. But the increase that we had from really people going from just primary school or very little education to university level of education, we've had that. So to some extent, that increase has been there, that boost to productivity has been there, and now it's harder. So that's, I think, what the French argument is partly about. Now, does that explain, is that a full story? No, I don't think it is. I think that a lot of the importance of education and skills comes from the fact that it is complementing the other things that we need for productivity. So you need skills if you want to make technology work. You need skills in the workplace if you want to get anything out of an information technology system in the workplace. You need to have the right skills in place for that. And that's, I think, this complementarity between skills and other things that are improving productivity is so important too. And a lot of the productivity commissions actually say that one of the main constraints we see at the moment for productivity is lack of skills, or skills mismatch. We just don't have the right skills. And of course, it's a very different conversation than we had only 5-6 years ago, where everybody was really worried about digital technologies, and people were really worried about the end of jobs and things like that. And now we're talking about something completely different. We're basically not talking about the end of jobs anymore. We're talking about the fact that we just don't have the right skills, and it's hard to get those skills to people who need them. To me, it's one of the biggest issues, I think, at the moment is skills, really.
Yeah. Thanks. Then I continue with another question, Dirk, for you and Tobias, and it's the environmental issue. The Institute of Fiscal Study in the UK published a report a couple of months ago about productivity measures, including the goods and deducting the bads, in order to make productivity measures in line with sustainability. So is it necessary to rethink the actual measurement of productivity to get it in line with the problems we have today?
Yeah, I think it is. And again, my former colleagues at the OECD has done work on this. I mean, there's been work on environmental adjusted productivity. So there's been work on that and trying to do that. I don't think that's the only issue. I think you can do that by making sure, for instance, one of the biggest examples I've seen on that is, for instance, Norway. It's basically, if you look at Norway, basically getting an enormous amount of growth and productivity from oil extraction and gas extraction and everything, the environmental, damage of that in the long run is, that you get a very different perspective on Norway's productivity growth if you adjust for the environmental impact of oil and gas extraction. And you would have that for many countries that would be mining quite a lot of fossil fuels, and other countries who would be doing that. You would have a very different perspective on a lot of the countries in the Middle East, for instance. that's one thing, but I think there are some other questions here at the moment. I think it's also about, what Germany is starting to think more about is, energy more generally. I think the link to resources, but also what is the real impact of climate change on productivity? I think a lot of people at the moment see the fact that we need to adjust to climate change as a cost, as a problem for productivity. But the problem is a little bit, if you think about the long run, if we don't adjust, there is no economy. So, you need to, so I think that's a bit of a short run, long run problem to some extent. So I think we need to think a bit more about that and do more work on that. And that is starting to happen a little bit at the moment. The Belgians' last productivity report really said, the impacts of climate change on productivity could be devastating. It could be really, really important. So we need to, and not only that short-term thing, like, yes, there is a cost here. And I think our appreciation of that cost is changing now as well with all the war in Ukraine. The fact that we now are moving more and more, and of course Sweden is quite far in that already, to renewable energy, which in many cases is actually going to be a lot cheaper in the long run than some of the fossil fuels that we have. And so that could be actually have a positive impact on productivity as well by making a lot of very abundant energy available for low prices possibly. So I think there's more to be done here, and this is still a bit of a new topic for productivity commissions to look into this.
Yeah, I agree, and from a Swedish perspective also, maybe I absolutely think we can gain or take advantage from the effects of climate change as well as in the whole transition of the economy, where if you see it as a structural change to industries where Sweden is well placed and in the front line in the global competitive situation. I think that could be a positive thing for Swedish, especially for the manufacturing industry.
But can it be the case that your wage demand now includes a reduction of the environment? So you should reduce it a bit to be in order to the common interest.
Well,
that's a difficult question.
Well, yeah, maybe it is. Maybe for the next bargaining round.
Yes. Okay.
We actually have some questions in the chat. Daniel, have you seen it?
No, my chat doesn't work, so you can really bring them up if you can.
Okay, the two I see. The first one was from let me see, from Anton. Sorry, I don't see the first name. Need to move. Anton Ringstrom, which is can you say anything about the impact of the different commissions? To what degree have policy proposals resulted in actual policy change, and are there any success factors for achieving policy changes? That's a good question. It's one I do know a little bit about, the Australian one, and I think they play an important role, but they're the ones who've been around for quite a long time, and and they also report to Parliament and so on. A lot of these other ones, and my paper wasn't really about this, but I think that is a great question to look into. I think it would probably require really talking to members of the productivity commissions in different countries and say, well, some of the things you've been recommending, are they feeding through? But there are some of these commissions that actually, are long-standing sort of advisory bodies, like in Germany, Syftet and Land, for instance, is one of the is the Productivity Commission in Germany, and I do think they have quite a bit of impact. So it's a good question and one worthy of more looking into. My expectation is that usually a lot of these things feed through slowly. At least that was my experience at the OECD as well. You may sometimes talk about something in your reports and bring it into the conversation, but before it actually turns into impact, it can take some time, and sometimes the policy environment isn't quite right yet, but it is something that I think people will be listening to. The second, there's one other question I see from Tony Kenta. Two questions about investment. Hasn't investment boomed with the extremely low interest rate during the period after the financial crisis? And how central is investment for productivity growth? Well, perhaps to start with the second question, I do think investment is really central to productivity growth. I mean, basically, if you look at growth over time, increases in capital intensity. So, investment is really what is driving a lot of labor productivity growth, at least. So it is really, really important. And we've seen in most countries that investment was higher sort of before the 2000s, or even before the financial crisis. It started to slow down probably a little bit before. And even though we had really low interest rates in many countries after the financial crisis, I don't think we've seen really this big boom in investment. And it's not only about low interest rates. I think there are other things here that seem to have caused the overall decline in investment that we are seeing in many OECD countries. And there is still quite a bit of discussion on where that comes from. And cyclical factors seem to be some of the reasons that people are looking at here as well. But worth looking into a little bit more. So I do think investment matters for productivity, and the fact that we've had this slowdown in investment is an important factor for the slowdown that we've seen. So those are the two questions I saw in the chat.
Thanks. Then I continue on that actually, because Dirk, when you write the report and you discuss the external factors and the domestic factors, the factors maybe you cannot affect that much, the global ones, how if you weight them, balance them, how much is external forces, how much is domestic forces, what can you actually do as a country?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question. I mean, I do think there are some things you probably can do quite a bit about, but there are some things, particularly as a smaller country, and Sweden is an important country, but it's not a huge country. You can't do much as Sweden, for instance, at the rate of technological progress globally. You can't do much about that. You probably can't do much on globalization. You probably can't do much about the fact that we've seen a structural shift from manufacturing to services. So there are some of these things that are, they've happened. There are structural changes in our economies, and there's not a lot you can do about them. There are other things I think that you have more control about, or at least you can do something about skills. You can do something about your innovation system. You can do something about, making your country an attractive place for investment and so on. You can do something about some of those things. So I think it is, important to try and focus on things where perhaps policy actions are possible. But it is, I think, good to understand as well what are some of the overall drivers of change. If we do know that technology is slowing down, and there is still a lot of discussion about that, but perhaps it has a little bit, at least we don't see the impact yet, then perhaps you should expect a little bit less. Perhaps we're not going to go back to 2% productivity growth. Perhaps we may have to be stuck with 1% or a little bit more. But perhaps we might not be able to go back to 2. But I think you can still look at everything you can do to make sure you don't go below 1. I think it's important for Sweden to try and stay at least at a good level of productivity growth, and see whether you can increase it a little bit and not go lower, because then you end up in a situation as some OECD countries, some European countries, where you have very little or even negative productivity growth. And that is not a good place to be in, I think, in the long run.
Does that answer show where you stand in the issue between Gordon and Brynjolfsson? Have we gone through the best part is behind us and we are looking forward to a bad period? Or
I don't know. I keep on reading about technology, and people are, now there's a whole discussion about Chat GPT. Basically, are we all going to be writing our articles and everything? Now, we're not going to do much anymore. There are some really improvements in productivity that could come from there, but is that generalizable? That I don't know. I mean, I think the problem is a little bit, sometimes we expect too much from technology. I think technology is important, but I think technology has its place in an overall production system within a company or within a government setting and so on. And sometimes the technology is only a tool, but you need to embed it into organizational changes, process changes, what Tobias was talking about, the workplace environment, the right management, these types of things. And if you don't do that, then you've got great technology, but you don't get a lot of impact probably coming from it. So I think there are some people who say, well, we might still see a lot of these benefits, and hopefully we'll see more of the benefits of all the technological change we're seeing, but it probably is more than just technology. So I think there are other things we need to be looking at as well. And I think that's what a lot of the agenda of productivity commissions needs to focus on as well, is some of these other factors that are probably needed apart from the technology itself. So the complementary investments in organizational change, process innovation within the firm, these types of things that are important to skills. Yeah.
Okay. And Tobias, when you discuss with your colleagues and the next wage bargaining round, do you see an improvement in productivity in the future, or do you think we will stay at kind of the level we have now in the increases?
I would say we often get stuck in a mindset of now we have a new normal situation, and this normal situation will last forever. I don't believe in new normals. I think there will always be another new normal if we just give some time. So, and of course we have to believe that we can change this again to get a higher productivity growth rate in the future. And if you look at when we actually do our assessments of the future wage levels, we look at what other experts say about the long-term productivity growth in the whole business sector. Assessments for example, from the Swedish National Institute of Economic Research, and they say that if you looked 10 years ahead, the growth rate will probably be a bit higher than it has been the last 10 or 15 years, but nothing compared to the situation before the great financial crisis.
I think one of the issues I think is as well that what we see a little bit in the data is that the leading firms, some of the frontier firms in many countries are able still to have reasonably good productivity growth, but it's a lot of the other firms in the economy which aims to have greater difficulties. And I think that, to me, that has a lot to do with all these other things as well. If you are a leading firm, you can probably, bring in the services, the advisory services, the skills and everything you need to make new technology work for you. If you're a small firm, or if you're, a small traditional firm that is trying to survive, it's much harder to do all these things. So it's harder to make all these complementary changes. And that means we're still seeing in quite a few countries this divergence between the leading firms that are able still to improve productivity because they can do a lot of these other things. They access to finance, they have a lot of things that are going well for them. And whereas a lot of the other firms have more difficulties doing that. So I think that plays a role here probably as well in terms of the overall picture we're then seeing in productivity, where the overall aggregate picture isn't that good, but there is a lot of diversity between the leading firms and some of the others that are not doing quite as well.
Yeah, thanks. We are running out of time. We have 3 minutes left. So if you have any specific comments you want to say before we end, otherwise I have a few questions after that.
I have no specific issues. I think I think it will be interesting to see what comes out of this debate in Sweden on productivity commissions. I think these do play an important role in my view, and I think there's a lot to learn still from each other. There's to me there's a bit of an experiment going on here. I mean, most of these productivity commissions have only been in operation for 3 or 4 years, so there's a lot to learn from them, and I think we're all learning in terms of what's coming out of this. So it'll be interesting to see when Sweden joins this experiment as well, and what will come out of that.
Thanks. But then I finish with 2 questions for you, Dirk.
Yeah.
The first is, Asimoglu has written a few papers about Japan and robotics, showing that sectors in countries with a negative demography actually push their productivity very high because your lack of competent skills.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, demography is the main driver of differences in the level of investment in robotics in different countries and sectors. So to add to this mess of different things, demography seems to be maybe an underlying force beneath everything we are discussing. And demography is one of the topics that some commissions have touched upon, but not much.
No. I think the only one I've seen it come up quite a bit is Germany. I do think there is another factor that is, affecting robotics and the role of robotics, which is basically the size of your manufacturing sector, because and of course Japan is a country, it needs robots probably more than any other country because of the very rapidly declining sort of population levels. I think forcing, there will be a push to increase productivity through technology in countries like that, and I think that's also one of the things that a country like Germany is raising, probably more a little bit linked to skill shortages. And of course, I think that could be one of the factors at the moment as well. We do see skill shortages and problems with skills in many countries, and that might lead to more investment perhaps in capital and more productivity increases, or at least contribute to that. So that's something I think we'll have to see in the next few years.
Thanks. And finally, what is your opinion on the demand side of productivity? We are discussing supply side very much. Looking after the financial crisis, I think demand has gone up and down. And is demand a factor that we have neglected too much, do you think? Or where are we in that question?
Yeah, there are some, I think this is something that some productivity commissions are also talking about, but it does come up, but it doesn't come up as a big factor, and also not something they have a lot of influence on. I think sometimes it comes up a little bit in the context of things like public procurement, but of course it's also not something they talk about in the link to macroeconomic policy, for instance. And so there are some things that seem to be a little bit out of bounds. I think a lot of productivity commissions are more focused on the supply side than they are on demand side at the moment. But no, I think you're right. That's definitely worth doing more thinking about as well, and at least putting that into the picture a little bit. But I do worry a little bit about there is a risk here that productivity commissions are just trying to take on too much. And they're the secretariat of most of these institutions is quite small. They have a small team typically, but that's also where things like collaboration across them, I think, could help, and to tackle some of these bigger questions sometimes perhaps together a little bit, and try to look at things together in some cases.
Thanks. And with these final words, we close this webinar for today. Many thanks to Dirk and Tobias for a very fruitful discussion, and hopefully we will continue this discussion in the years to come when the Swedish Commission is up and going. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.